Right, welcome back to another conversation. So today I've got with me George Martin, also known as Carnism Debunked, and this is the second installment in sort of like a mini series or whatever on the topic of intersectionality. So I wanted to explore, you know, uh, what would intersectionality look like if it was applied to antinatalism? Should it be applied to antinatalism? What sort of good things and bad things have been seen from it being applied to other things? And all of that sort of stuff, just to start that conversation off. So I've already had a conversation which will be out by now with Ashley or Ash Wickety on social media, talking about why antinatalism should be intersectional. And now I'm going to have a conversation with George about, maybe why we should be more hesitant or maybe why we should be against intersectionality being applied to antinatalism. So before we get into the sort of main bulk, do you just want to introduce yourself a bit and Carnism Debunked?
Hey, yeah, sure. I've been an animal rights activist for a number of years now. I've been vegan since 2013, January 2013. So nearly 10 years now that I've been vegan. Um, I do a lot of social media activism, street activism as well. Like I'm the organizer for the We the Free group here in Bristol and Bath. And I was formerly as well doing street outreach as an organizer with Anonymous for the Voiceless as well. And I run the Carnism Debunked platform, which is about responding to all the anti-vegan arguments we get. So that's the carnismdebunked.com website. I also have a podcast and stuff where sit down and speak with loads of really cool people within the movement every so often. So you can check that out, the Carnism Debunked podcast on all the major podcast platforms and on YouTube as well. And yeah, I've been an anti-natalist since probably about 2015, I would say. I think those two issues, you know, quote unquote, intersect quite well. However, obviously, what we're going to talk about today is maybe going to be where I think things don't intersect, if that makes sense. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and before we go on, just to stroke your ego a bit, so with the Carnism Debunk website, that I think I've probably told you this before. Actually, that was where I got the idea to do the antinatalist handbook, which is sort of like the antinatalist version of what you did. So, like, I knew about your website before I'd met you,
Mhm.
so I'd known about it for ages, and then it just sort of occurred to me one day, like, yeah, why is there not an antinatalist version of this? Um, so you can take the credit for that.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
So yeah. So let's go on to intersectionality then. So just to start things off, obviously people who have seen the first video will have an idea of what intersectionality is, because I got Ashley to sort of explain how she sort of understands it. But just so everyone knows where you're coming from, do you want to explain what you actually understand by intersectionality?
So there's the definition of intersectionality that most intersectionals give, and then there's the definition of intersectionality that is not given, but I would actually say is a more accurate reflection. Now,
Mm,
obviously, I haven't seen this thing with Ash yet because at the
yeah.
time of this recording, it hasn't been uploaded. And there are some intersectionals who might not take on the exact definition of intersectionality that I'm going to give. But you know the 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 definition that most intersectionals will give of intersectionality is just talking about how various oppressions intersect and how we can't solve one injustice without solving the other. And it comes from Kimberly Crenshaw's theory and blah blah blah. This isn't really the intersectionality we see in this day and age and how we see it, how it works in animal rights spaces and so on. And I don't imagine it would be much different if it was to be introduced to antinatalism spaces. So my definition of intersectionality, which I think is way more accurate, and I think most people who have experienced it will relate to, is intersectionality is based on two premises. Um, One, that the thing that it's a part of, let's call it veganism, so intersectional veganism, is as much a human rights movement as it is an animal rights movement. So that I'm not sure how that would reflect exactly into antinatalism, but I'll continue.
Well,
And then number two,
mm.
yeah, go on.
Well, I was going to say, like, I think how it would reflect in antinatalism is that it's a movement that focuses just as much on the situation of the parent than it does on the child. I would guess, maybe. I
Right.
guess that's how it
Yeah.
would map on.
Yeah, that makes sense. But then premise number two would be that not only that, but it is a far left political movement as well as that. So we've
Mm.
seen this a lot in animal rights, wherever intersectional veganism is involved. And, one of the biggest drawbacks of this is I think that intersectionality seems to have like a monopoly on what it means to be anti oppression, which is the biggest problem that I find with it. So an intersectional might say to you, "Oh, um, but we can't, do veganism like this because how can we support oppression while in fighting against oppression? Don't you think we should be against all forms of oppression?" And it's like, yes, but every single vegan is against all forms of oppression. The point is, everyone has a different opinion on what is oppressive and what is not. It's
Mm.
so entitled when I hear these people say, "Oh, how can you have like a Trump supporter in the vegan movement? Aren't we supposed to be against oppression?" It's like, but you just voted for Joe Biden in the last election, and you support gun control, and you're pro-choice, and you defend religious belief systems like Islam, which persecute gay people and women, and you support socialism, and there's all these other things that millions of people worldwide find oppressive. Yet intersectionals just label these as anti-oppression, and then anything that leans further right than that as oppressive. It's just like this quite
Yeah,
simplistic
yeah.
scale.
So it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong. So it seems like we have to kind of draw a distinction between actual intersectionality and kind of how it's practiced in real life. Um, and I
Mm.
think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like most of the issues that at least we'll be talking about probably fall on the side of like how it's actually practically sort of put forward or practiced, or however you want to put it. And before we get on to that, going back to like intersectionality itself, um, ignoring the sort of practical issues, are there any things you sort of disagree or like with intersectionality about in a sort of abstract textbook manner rather than how it's actually applied, if you get what I mean, like the actual theory of it?
No, because I think the actual textbook definition sounds fantastic. To be against all forms of oppression, that's me. To
Mm.
believe that different people have different experiences based on who they are, yeah, we do. To understand how
Mm.
these things might intersect differently. This sounds fantastic, doesn't it? Shouldn't we all be intersectional, Lawrence? But then when you actually see how it's being applied in the animal rights movement, it's just been an absolute fucking disaster. It has been a complete nightmare.
Mm.
It's tried to politicize the animal rights movement. And my fear is that when applied to antinatalism, it's just going to politicize that. And yeah, okay, people can say, "Oh, but this is political and life is political." Okay, yeah, of course you can say that certain things about veganism and antinatalism could be political. But again, it's that they want a monopoly on what type of politics. It's left-wing political, not
Mm.
centrism, not conservatism. These would all be, to many intersectionals, fascist. They consider like anything right of
Mm.
the far left as like fascist. So this has been a huge problem within the animal rights movement.
Mm. And that is an amazing segue for the next question, because I was going to go on to like, so both, I think both yours and my, and like, I know I'm speaking for you here, but I think both of our experience of intersectionality so far, or at least the majority of it, has been experiencing its application in veganism and animal rights spaces, right? Because that's, that's sort of like the the sort of movement or issue that we're most involved in.
Mhm.
So you've already talked about how like in practical terms, intersectionals or intersectionality kind of politicized animal rights in like a toxic way. Um, what other sort of ways have you seen intersectionality corrupt, if that's not too a stronger word, animal rights spaces, or like make them more toxic, or whatever people, and insert negative word there, if you get what I mean.
I think it tries to kind of like, it tries to often distract focus from the oppressed away to issues upon the oppressor. But then intersectionals will say, "Oh, but these people who oppressed this group too are oppressed." Like you saw with like the BLM hysteria in 2020, intersectionals were dogpiling animal rights groups and getting them to speak up for this far left capitalist group,
Mm,
BLM, who they call a socialist group but aren't. They've raked in millions and millions and millions and spent it on
mm,
mansions and so on. Um, and people would be saying at the time, guys, this is an animal rights group. You're meant to be focusing on the animals here. And then they'll just say stuff like, but humans are animals too. But the problem is, intersectionality only ever goes one way, right? It always just, whatever movement it seems to appear in, I say whatever movement it seems to appear in, actually, I would just say when it's in the animal rights movement, I would say. What it tends to do is it's like you scrutinize only ever the things like the things that animal rights activists are doing and say you must have this view on this and this view on this, but it doesn't hold that with other movements. Like they've never dogpiled BLM and said, why aren't you posting about this turkey who got murdered yesterday? But
mm.
it's like every animal rights group has to post in support of some guy who dies in Minnesota. Like, what the fuck does that have to do with veganism? And I wouldn't even mind so much, if they were just like they held that position and they dogpiled BLM and said, BLM, why aren't you talking about the animal holocaust? But they don't. They literally do not do that at all. They don't put. They don't have anywhere near the same energy. I say anywhere near. They don't have. They don't have the energy at all for human rights groups. It's the negative focus is only ever on vegans, vegan activists, and the distracting away from animal rights issues. They would not dare distract away from a human rights cause and say
Mm.
you must focus here on the animals.
Yeah, like the way that I sort of saw it when everything was sort of popping off around sort of 2020 time, it seemed like there were like three main ways that intersectionality was having a negative impact on animal rights. Now, like whether that was the intention of the people introducing intersectionality is another question, but how it actually practically sort of how the actual fallout went, it seemed like there were like three main things. One was that there was like a chilling effect on discussion. Like people didn't feel like they could share their opinions, or at least some people didn't. A lot of people didn't feel like they could share their
Yeah.
opinions. And in in a movement like animal rights that is on the fringe of society, it's more important in those movements than any other movement to be able to have like honest and honest discussions with each other and feel like you're allowed to share your opinions, because we're on the fringe of society. No one else is going to have the discussions with us, so we've got to have them with each other, and we need to make sure we're doing things in the most effective way. So we need to be able to communicate with each other. The other thing was like cancellation sort of campaigns. Like if someone, well, I mean, like more than most people, like if someone says something, or if someone you know gets a certain amount of money via Patreon or something like that, that's deemed to be too much by a group of people, then a sort of campaign was launched against them, and that just discourages people from doing activism. And the third
Mm.
thing was the whole trying to define, um, like basically what is a vegan. Like you have to have a certain, you can't be vegan unless you have these opinions on other sort of issues.
Right.
And like when I say that, I do not mean this by any case or by any extent that applies to every intersectional. It's just that that is how it just resulted. There probably were a lot of intersectionals who were like, "Ah, this is really shit." You know, we wanted intersectionality to be introduced in a healthy way, but it just, you know, it sort of backfired and it didn't really get introduced in a healthy way. But yeah, those seem to be like the big sort of ways that it kind of was a bit of a fuck up with animal rights. Before we go on, do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, I just want to say about the point too you raised there about the money stuff. This was another huge hypocrisy. So you get intersectional saying stuff, you know, like there's all this money shaming from them in animal rights. Like if an activist or an activist group is getting however much money, it's like this is bad and this is capitalist and stuff. But at the same time, they're asking everyone to donate to mega multi-millionaire mansion buying conglomerate Black Lives Matter. So there's a huge, huge inconsistency there. Once again, the animals, the victims get screwed over. It's like you can't have money in this movement. Oh, but you've got to pour your money into BLM, otherwise you're a racist. And they haven't said a thing about the criminal behavior from Patrice Cullors and so on at the head of BLM. They haven't said a thing about the mansions. They haven't said a thing about that they bailed out anti-Semite attempted murderer Quintez Brown for 200 grand. They're dead silent on all this. But the minute
Mm.
Paul and Asal from AV pay them however much, so it like peanuts in comparison to what Cullors earns in salary, it's like, oh, look at these, you know, these capitalists, and this is so bad for the vegan movement and blah blah blah. And it's like, once again, it's like the animals always get the bum deal in veganism.
Mm.
And ultimately, I've just seen it as a way of always putting the humans above the animals in the movement. And I guess this could be one of my fears with it coming into antinatalism. It could be that, like, not only the animals who are murdered as a result of children and the child themselves who is forced into the world of suffering, they're not the victim. It could be about making the parents who procreate the victim. I don't know how it would work. So, yeah.
Mm. Well, yeah. So that was the next thing I wanted to go on to is like how intersectionality would actually look in antinatalism, because it seems like, you know, intersectionality has been applied to a lot of what people terms like culture war issues, right? Sort of like racial differences, transgenderism, gender generally, also to an extent like economic divides as well, like rich poor, and then, you know, sort of a bit less, but still on the sort of outskirts, it was applied to animal rights as well. But it antinatalism is something that's like most people haven't even heard of it, let alone have applied an academic theory to it. Do you get what I mean? So it's like I don't think anyone has actually like I don't. There are like, as far as I'm aware, there are no papers on how intersectionality would be applied to antinatalism or anything like that. So I've done a bit of like guesswork, and I sort of presented that to Ashley, and sort of got her reaction from that. And I can sort of present the same thing to you and see what you think. So it seems to me like the way that intersectionality could be applied to antinatalism, if it was, is it could be applied in two ways, and there's one way. One of those two ways I think is going to be more likely, and the other way, or and like better received. So I think the two ways are what you would call like a victim centered sort of application and like a perpetrator centered application, right? So the victim centered application would look at the child who is born and look at who they are, whether that be their economic situation, their race, you know, their sex, etc., etc. And from that, it would then put, you know, it would then sort of how would you call it, like it would focus on the degree towards the degree to which life is an imposition on them, right? So intersectionality may say that if a kid in an affluent country is born, then it may not be as bad as a kid in a poor country. Because the sort of imposition of life is worse in one case than the other, even though they're both bad. So it could be in that way, but it could also be applied in another way, which is like the perpetrator, if that's not too like strong a word, like application, which is focusing on the parent. So it could then flip. So intersectionals could then say, well, actually we need to focus on people procreating in the West more, because the people in the West have more education, more technology, and so they're more responsible for their actions, whereas people in poorer countries, they have less education, and they maybe have less access to technology, and so it's not as much their fault if they get pregnant and have a child, if you get what I mean. So depending on how intersectionality is applied, you could actually flip where you focus your criticism more, and where you're more like sympathetic, if you get what I mean. So what do you think about those sort of two different applications?
I don't know if you've maybe spoke about it too too highly as for what it actually might look like if it was to come into. I mean, put it this way: if we're going to see the type of intersectionality that we've seen in vegan spaces being applied to
Mm.
antinatalism spaces, it's not going to look as like clever and thoughtful and stuff as that. It will be more just like from a very Western-centric lens, and it might just be like, you are a cis white male, you do not have the right to tell a black trans woman that she cannot have a baby. This kind
Mm.
of stuff, like that's the way I would see it kind of looking. If the type of intersectionality we're seeing in veganism is to go into vegan spaces basically.
Yeah, no, I get what you mean, and I think it's yeah, because I think like what I did there is sort of like take the academic theory as best I could and apply it to antinatalism, but actually in reality that's not what people do. They sort of have like this sort of wanky blue head caricature of intersectionality, and then apply that to a given issue, whether that be animal rights or antinatalism. And again, that's not what every intersectional does, but it's
Yeah.
just often how it works out. So I kind of agree with you. I think like
Right.
I can foresee, with animal rights, there was and Ashley and I talked about this, there was the whole thing about the slaughterhouse workers. And there was like a big divide
Mm.
over that about, whether we should be putting any time and energy into supporting slaughterhouse workers, or we should just solely
Yeah.
focus on the animals. And I
Yeah.
and I can sort of, that became a flashpoint, and I can see that um happening with antinatalism, especially with, like you said, like Western people being made to feel like they can't ever comment on any sort of issue that's happening in a quote unquote like developing country, if you get what I mean.
Well, the problem is, I wouldn't mind it even so much if their mantra was we can't comment on it in developing countries. Their mantra is you can't comment on it if you are of this demographic in the country that you live in, like in Western countries. It's not
Mm,
even a case of you can't comment on this happening in Africa. It's a case of you can't comment on a black person in the UK doing this just for the sole because they're a different skin color than you. It's like racial identity politics, like put into, and it's so Western centric. Again, Lawrence, I think you might even be giving them too much credit by talking about the whole Africa thing. Intersectionals largely don't give a fuck about Africa. They weren't saying, like, again, look at the 2020 thing. Why weren't they bullying and harassing, Peter, Mercy for Animals, AV, Viva, whoever? Why weren't they saying, why aren't you speaking about the war in the Central African Republic? Why aren't you speaking about the Uyghurs being put in the concentration camps in China? No, nothing. They didn't mention any
mm,
of those things. It's just like some random dude dies in fucking Minnesota. Why aren't you raising the fist for him and posting your black square? Like the most microscopic fucking issue in comparison to all the fucked up shit going on in the world. And they didn't say anything about any of those issues. They're so Western centric. Let's not pretend that this would be a thing about Africa here. They don't say anything about Africa. It's just about shit that goes on in America. And many of these people are like, I doubt that many of these people, this is kind of going into an American stereotype here.
Yeah.
But I doubt that many of these people even have like passports and stuff. And they may have never even left the little like US coastal bubble, and they think the world like revolves around what happens in their US coastal bubble. I'll give you an example, right? I remember it's like they once tried to cancel James Aspie because Donald Trump appeared in James Aspie's dream. I shit you not. He wrote this post about, yeah, I had a dream and
Really?
Donald Trump said this to me. Yeah, yeah. And he got all these comments like, oh my God, why are you commenting about this? Why is Donald Trump appearing in your dreams and shit? Like, it was crazy shit, Lawrence. And James Aspie was like, look, I don't even like, I'm in Australia. I don't even really know that much about Donald Trump and his policies and blah, blah, blah. And they were like, why don't you know about Donald Trump and his policies? You are so ignorant. You should know about this. And I was commenting to all these people saying, name without Googling who the Prime Minister of Australia is. And of course, Lawrence, none of them had a fucking clue, did they? So it just, they're so like, it's not even just, it's like very America-centric, even more than Western-centric, and just about like all the world and all the animal rights movement should just conform to every little thing that the media pushes in any kind of manufactured hysteria that goes on in America, basically.
And how do you think? Because like I think at some point, like, oh, so actually, first thing, so you know how you were saying, like, it's the way it plays out is very sort of Western centric. I'm hoping that, because I think intersectionality at some point it will get introduced to antinatalism. Whether we want it or not, with that sort of episode of things will happen. Regardless of anyone's opinion on it, I think there will be a time when there becomes like a sort of, what happened in veganism happens in antinatalism. I think that probably will happen, but I think that it will maybe happen to a lesser degree, because it seems like, and maybe this is just like, you can take this or leave this, you can completely throw this out, because I've not done a survey or a study like that or anything, but it seems like antinatalism is much more international than veganism. Even though veganism is all over the world, it does seem that, at least online, and maybe this is because we're in the West, so we move in more Western circles, but it seems like a lot of the people who are sort of creating content and stuff are generally in the West, and so they maybe there's more of a skew towards intersectionality, whereas and that it's more susceptible to, they're more susceptible to being Western centric. But in antinatalism, like, it seems like people are like from basically every country, and some of the interviews I've put out, some of the ones that people have been most hyped about have been discussions with people who are in Algeria or South Africa, for example, rather than in America or something like that. Do you think that has any validity to it, or do you think that's not going to protect at all? Or do you think I've just sort of like had a misanalysis or whatever?
Yeah, maybe a misanalysis. I haven't noticed that either antinatalism or veganism being more international than the other, if that makes sense. But then again, I guess we're both in kind of Western spaces with those things.
Yeah.
But I guess culturally, here's the thing. This is why it's hard to know, because culturally there are cultures more open to veganism than not, and I think Western cultures are leading the way there in that sense. With antinatalism, it doesn't seem like any culture is that open to it, or has even heard of it, or considers it. Like even here in the
Yeah.
UK, if you say to someone, I'm an antinatalist, they say, what's that? So that is kind of
Yeah.
like
And then you
how,
tell them and then they burn you.
yeah, exactly. So, um, but yeah, maybe it would be hard to say in that sense. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I get that. So if or when intersectionality sort of comes into antinatalist spaces, um, How do you think that we can best avoid the divisiveness and the bad stuff that came out of it when it was applied to veganism? Do you think there's anything we can do to like prepare for that? Or maybe just when it comes, we behave in a certain way or whatever? Like, do you think there's anything we can do to make it as smooth a process as possible?
Yes, everyone needs to stand up for themselves. What happens with it coming into vegan spaces is people let themselves be gaslighted and bullied into thinking that they're bad people because they didn't post their black square, or they don't identify as a feminist, or whatever it is. Like, people, and this is how like kind of woke politics works. It tends to prey on weak-minded and vulnerable people who, when you label them something, they then say to themselves, "Oh, okay, I guess I am that thing that you just called me." There is a fallacy, right, called Kafka trapping,
Mm,
where the denial of the thing you're accused of makes you more of a thing. So it's like, you're a racist. I'm not a racist. That's something a racist would say. You're denying your privilege, kind of thing. It's like, but I'm not. Like, so it's a very like, this is the fallacy that they often use, and unfortunately, so many people are just so weak-minded, and they'll just be like, "Oh, okay, I guess I'll donate my money then to the organization, and I'll post my little post saying I'm sorry for being the skin color I was, or the gender I was, or whatever it
mm.
is." So I this is how, when these things come across, we need to stand up against them. People just need to actually stop being such little weak little pushovers. And again, I'm not tarring all intersectionals with the same brush here. But the majority of intersectionals are the ones who push that kind of bullying, kind of dogpiling, woke politics onto people, hurling labels and accusations and making very slanderous claims that are completely untrue against people, and making them conform through fear, through social punishment,
Mm.
to what it is that they want them to, you know, conform to.
Yeah, and I'm kind of hoping, and I said this to Ashley in the other video, I'm kind of hoping that like this conversation and the one I had with Ashley maybe help contribute to it being a smoother process, because when it does get properly introduced, I think one of the reasons that it was so messy in veganism is that it was like it was very small, and then it just came out of nowhere and went everywhere, and everyone had to have an opinion on it
Mm,
basically. And it was like a flash in the pan,
yeah.
and so people didn't really have a time to like sit back, reflect, think, what do I actually think about this? Because it just came out of nowhere, and then there was loads of pressure on people to either have an opinion or or they couldn't even stay silent, because if you stayed silent, that was violence, right? So it was like, I think that was a very
Right.
sort of like toxic environment for it to be introduced to. Whereas I'm hoping with this conversation, at least it'll introduce the concept to people and make them aware of past mistakes that happened in veganism, so that people can sort of already form their opinion now, so that when it gets properly introduced, hopefully people will be aware of what it is, and they maybe understand the dynamics of how it's played out before, so that they can be ready, basically, if you get what I mean.
Well, to use another cooking analogy there, Lawrence, for me, it wasn't a flash in the pan. It never
Mm,
was. For me, veganism was the frog being slowly boiled in the pot of water, and the temperature was just raising up and up and up. And you say to people, guys, we need to be combating this stuff. Oh no, don't worry about it. It's fine. Like, this won't have any effect. No, guys, seriously, I'm seeing, like, I just saw in a Facebook group today, somebody got called a racist because they said that animal agriculture is slavery. Oh, someone just got told, that they are a sexist or a misogynist because they said that some people can lie about rape or something like that. And it's like, we need to be combating against this, guys, and making some posts about this and how dangerous this is. No, 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 don't worry. And then suddenly, boom, like, it all just like explodes, and
mm,
people get cancelled, and they lose their jobs, and they're socially punished, and they're ostracized, and they get slandered and stuff. So for me, it never was a flash in the pan. But
mm,
I guess I was always one of the people who was quite aware from it. I guess because of my first ever experience with an intersectional, which was in 2015. I remember it because it was a very, very significant moment in my life. It was the first time in my life where I'd ever been called a racist or it been insinuated that I'm a racist. It was December 2015. People are like, "What, George? You remember the date?" And it's like, yes, I do remember the date because I've spent my whole life not being called like any of these things. I was just like, "Hey, George, a really nice guy who cares about everyone and is pro-equality." And then I go into this movement and it's like, "George is a this, George is a that." And it was, again, I think it was because I called animal agriculture slavery somewhere. And then, this weird intersectional loom was like, "Aren't you late for your KKK rally, George?" or something like that. I was like, what did I just get? Like, this was like it was a totally alien situation for me because I'd never ever heard that before. Now I hear it all the time from the woke mob that I'm a this and I'm a that, just because I'm not on the far left, basically. And so I guess I was always attuned to it, like, from the start.
So there have been like, and you've mentioned a few already, or we've both mentioned a few. There was like a general culture of, treading on eggshells and stuff, that intersectionality brought about. But there were also some key like issues where things really ramped up around. So there was the James Aspie and the word Holocaust, and the word slavery as well. There was the BLM issue, when AV made the post with the guy was holding the pig's head, and that then sort of like a drama was around that as well. So there's been like a few sort of specific issues that these dramas have sort of coalesced around. Um, do you have any, and it's no worries if not, because no one can predict the future, but do you have any gut feeling about what these sort of things may be in antinatalism? What specific issues intersectionality may coalesce around, like drama wise?
Yeah, for sure. I think it will like, there'll be definitely a drama around racism if you say something like, "Oh,
Mm,
how fucked is it that people are procreating in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, into those countries where it's like you're basically just funneled into a life of oppression and subjugation and authoritarianism from the start." I can imagine them people saying, "Oh my God, you're an Islamophobe, you're racist. There's oppression here in the United Kingdom. How dare you cis white privileged males, say that it's particularly bad to have a child born in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia? You call out, like, I can see things happening like that. Definitely stuff based on race issues.
mm,
If you particularly focus on that, it's worse to procreate in certain cultures than others, which is true. We have to have nuance in things.
mm,
I think all procreation is bad. It is. But of course, it's
mm,
worse to create a kid in Saudi Arabia than it is in the UK. I mean, like, the lives are like fucking polar opposites. Even though life still sucks here, at least we're free to a certain extent. From Saudi Arabia, it's just like
mm,
you're oppressed from day one. Like, it's so cruel to have a kid in Saudi Arabia. Now, if antinatalism becomes intersectional, I'm going to get called a racist for saying that. So these are the types of things I can see happening. These are the types of cancel cultures and call out campaigns that will happen if intersectionality ever gets some kind of foothold. Also, that men having a say over what women do with their bodies. You should only leave women.
yeah, I was thinking that was going to be one
Right,
as
right.
well.
You should only let women choose if they want to, go through with the pregnancy or whatever the hell it is. It's just like, it just gets messy wherever it is. And here's the thing as well, Lawrence. It's like you said, treading on eggshells. That's the perfect thing, right, for you to say, because it's like, when we are advocating something such as animal rights or antinatalism, we can't tiptoe around things. We have to understand that people find the
Mm,
truth offensive. And intersectionality and woke politics are all about avoiding offending certain groups. And it's like, no, you have to just say something, whether it's true or not. Of course, it's going to be offensive if I say, it's immoral to procreate. Oh, especially if people in this country, or whatever the hell it is. Of course, that's going to be offensive. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether something's offensive or not. Does not negate the validity of the argument. It doesn't detract from the merit of the argument. So
Mm.
this is why this treading on eggshells culture is so dangerous for animal rights and for antinatalism, because you've got to just be able to speak the truth, because people don't like the truth, and who cares? Like, you've got to just say it regardless.
Yeah, no, I agree. I do think like one of the like key things that it's going to coalesce around is like sex, basically. Like I can definitely foresee, you know, how in the abortion debate there's a sort of mantra that some people say is that men can't have an opinion on it because you know, they don't have
Yes.
or it's no uterus, no opinion, right? um
Yeah.
I can definitely
Transphobic.
see
Sorry, Carrie.
I can definitely see how that could like transfer over into antinatalism. Like, you know, um, like I guess it's like before like a woman becomes pregnant, it's both sexes' responsibility to avoid the pregnancy, right? But once the pregnancy happens, that is when, like, when you're talking about someone who's already pregnant, that is when I can like foresee an issue coming around where it's like then antinatalist men are not allowed to have any opinion um on whether an abortion like it is like the best way to go, if you get what I mean. um and sorry, you go.
Again, I think, yeah, I think you might be giving them too much credit there again, Lawrence, because I can see it happening before the woman is pregnant. And I'll tell you why I can see it happening before the woman is pregnant. It's because I've experienced this before. I have spoke to someone who's quite woke and on the far left before about antinatalism. And she even told me then that antinatalism is like anti-feminist and is like pro-oppression, because
Hmm.
men shouldn't be telling women what to do with their bodies. This is pre-pregnancy we're talking about here.
Okay, I
We're
get what
talking
you
about
mean. Yeah, yeah,
actually
yeah.
going round and having sex with people and unprotected and having kids or whatever it is. I think they're even talking about like that stage.
Mm,
So, and even though it's nothing to do with specifically a woman's body, it takes a man and a woman to procreate. So that's a
mm,
bullshit argument anyway. But this is the type of these arguments aren't rational. We know this. We've seen that woke arguments are just not rational. It's all about this group cannot say this about this group, and this group is the oppressor, and this group is the privileged one.
mm. I can also maybe see, like, just on a very basic level, I've met some antinatalists before that are against any or when I say met, I mean like interacted with like online and stuff. I've interacted with some antinatalists who are just against activism full stop, because they say, you know, it's something for you know, it is a position you can have for yourself, but you shouldn't be telling other people what they do with their body. So that's like a more extreme version of the gender divide of saying men shouldn't tell women. It's just like you shouldn't tell anyone else. So I can see that as a potential one as well. The other one I can see is around like economics, like people who are
Mm.
like middle class or upper class, or even just people in the West should not be telling like people who are less economically uh um what, like, have less money, basically, what they should be doing. So, you know, middle class or rich people should not be telling like poor people or people in the working class what they should be doing, because, you know, historically society has been run by rich people, and so this is just another form of the rich oppressing the poor. So I can see like classical Marxism kit coming in there of like the class divide, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, and they might even say that it's some kind of like white supremacist conspiracy theory, or it's some kind of like, not conspiracy theory, conspiracy, should I say? So they might say that antinatalism is just this ploy to like make other races procreate less or something.
Mm,
Like, I can see that kind of stuff come into play as well. Ultimately, mate, yeah, I can just see it being very messy, very divisive, very political, very identity politics based. And so for me, intersectionality just has, like, what's wrong with antinatalism as it is? Why would it need to be intersectional? Like, what are we doing that's so bad? What are we doing that's so oppressive or so non-understanding? What is there to understand other than that procreation is wrong in every circumstance? Like, it's not a circumstantial thing. It's not like, oh, okay, it's bad for you to procreate, but it's okay for you. It's like the antinatalist message is that it's wrong in every case. Why would we need intersectionality here? What exactly is its purpose? What's its aim, other than to maybe just try and get people to conform to far left politics, so that certain politicians get elected in America or whatever it is? Because that's what I kind of think is happening in the animal rights movement. I kind of think, to be honest, it's just acted as like a recruitment procedure to get people to sign up to left-wing politics. It's just like, oh, what movement can we infect now? I know, let's just choose vegans and let's get them to all be like really far left so that we can like kick Trump out of office or whatever it's been. Because let's face it, the issues that they talk about aren't related to the things we want to talk about. It's just like a big like distraction thing.
Do you like? Can you think of any downsides? And I think you've kind of already answered it, but I want to ask it explicitly just in case. Like, can you think of any downsides of the situation? Well, the current situation of antinatalism not being intersectional. Can you see anything, any sort of good thing that intersectionality could bring to the table? Which, you know, maybe it didn't do this in veganism, but maybe it could be better in antinatalism. Can you see any sort of good addition to the sort of state of play or whatever that intersectionality could bring that we would be lacking without?
I'll have to listen to your video of Ash to maybe formulate my points on this, because I'm sure she might bring up some good points. But from what I've seen, I haven't seen intersectionality play any kind of positive role at all in animal rights. So I can't imagine why it would play any kind of positive role in antinatalism. If it ain't broken, don't fix it. There's nothing wrong with antinatalism as it is. Our message is great. Don't have kids. It's always wrong to procreate. I can't think, I can't. What are they trying to? Again, what are they trying to sort of like fix here? Like, what's wrong with the antinatalism message as it is? And I guess that's been my thing with veganism as well. It's like, why are you trying to turn what could otherwise be a quite successful movement that has lots of diversity of opinion? Why are you trying to turn it into like a leftist movement about the oppressor? It just seems like I'm scratching my head to think of what benefit this could possibly bring to anything, because it hasn't brought any kind of benefit to animal rights. It's just proved cancerous so far. So I know the answer is no.
Yeah, I think when I was speaking to Ashley, and I'm not going to remember like verbatim, so people will just have to watch the video. But I remember us sort of saying I remember us talking about some things that are good ways to view things, like being sensitive to some of the nuances of, you know, like you said before, like we're all different people and we come at things from different perspectives. That is true, so we should be sensitive to that. And we kind of talked about that, but then we also thought like, well, is that worthy of the label of an intersectional antinatalism, or is that not just what we're doing already, if you get what I mean? So it's sort of like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's one way, it's one thing to say these are healthy ways that we can spread antinatalism, but it's another then to identify, like, is that intersectional? And there may be healthier ways of spreading antinatalism than what we're doing already, but are they necessarily intersectional ways, or are they just different ways?
Right. And here's the thing, Lawrence. By the old classic great sounding definition of intersectionality, we're all intersectional. In fact, I'm more intersectional than the average intersectional is, because I'm calling out human rights groups for their bullshit as well, which they won't do. I'm truly intersectional because I'm trying to solve all issues of injustice here. I don't want anti-Semitism to be in BLM. I don't want them raking in loads of fucking cash, so I call them out for it. They
Mm,
don't say a thing. I don't want oppression. I don't want oppression anywhere in the world. I don't want human rights groups doing it. I don't want animal rights groups doing it. Again, with intersection, but with this, the way we're actually seeing intersectionality manifest, yeah, it's this heavily extremist politicized thing, and it's not just the classic definition of um, different people have different experiences based on who they are, and we need to solve all forms of oppression, and different forms of oppression are linked to the other, which is something they don't even agree with anyway, because if you make
mm.
perfectly good comparisons like, oh look, this is what happened in the Jewish Holocaust, and this is what's happening in the animal Holocaust, and oh look at that, gas chambers, and oh look, they're being sent to the death camps in the trucks. You are an anti-Semite for saying that. How can you say this? It's like, but I thought you said all oppressions are interconnected. Like, I'm the fucking intersectional here. You're not the intersectional.
Yeah, I actually, another one just popped into my head of like the flashpoints that intersectionality could coalesce around in antinatalism, which is things like maternity pay. Like, it seems like a really specific issue, but I can see something blowing up around that because, a lot of antinatalists would say, well, no, of course, women or men with paternity pay should not be getting paid to take time off work for having a kid because they chose to have the kid. Like, if you choose to have a child, you need to suck up the time that you take off work, right? But then other
Right.
people, I would expect that to be the non-intersectional point of view. But then the intersectional point of view would be, well, okay, it was bad that they, had the child, but we need to be sensitive to people going into poverty, etc., etc. Or, you know, this is a form of oppressing women because it'll mean that women are sort of limited in their options or whatever. I'm not sure exactly how they would say it, but I could see an issue like something so specific as maternity pay um,
Mm.
being sort of like a hot button thing. And there could be loads of them like that. It's just they haven't come up yet, so they're kind of hard to think of.
Yeah. That's an interesting one because that's not an issue I've specifically thought about from an antinatalist standpoint. Obviously,
Mm,
I'm antinatalist as fuck, but I've always supported maternity pay and paternity leave and pay
mm,
and blah, blah, blah. So, but I haven't since becoming an antinatalist reconsidered my
mm.
views on those.
Yeah,
Um,
I honestly don't
Maybe
have
I should,
like
I don't know.
yeah, well, I like I've had conversations with people about it before, and I obviously haven't like gotten to a fully formed opinion on it yet. I haven't like maybe it's something I'll do like a discussion with someone on and just like explore the topic because I don't know.
Mm.
I think it's one of those topics that is not really the most pressing issue, but because it's like, are antinatalists going to be able to influence whether people get maternity pay? Are they fuck? Like we're nowhere near having that sort of influence. So it's sort of like an irrelevant conversation anyway, but it's maybe
Yeah.
like one of those interesting ones. Um, cool. So before we like close, do you have anything that you think we've missed that you want to talk about, or any sort of like advice you want to give people, or anything like that?
My advice is, um, if you see any of this stuff happening, this toxic like call out culture happening, based on people's skin color and saying you can't have an opinion on this because you're a this, and um, you know if you're an animal rights group but you should be donating to this human rights cause, supposed human rights cause, um, actually stand up and actually say something, do something about it. That's my only advice really that I can give, because otherwise what's happening is, well, what will happen to antinatalism is exactly what's happened to the vegan movement. It's been totally poisoned by this stuff. We are seeing an animal rights movement where people are
Mm,
trying to politicize it into a far left human rights movement. Um, and I fear that in antinatalist spaces, we could see that be poisoned and being turned into a breeder movement rather than a non-existence rights movement, if that makes sense. So antinatalism is essentially about the rights of us to not exist. What intersectionality could mean for it is the rights of people already in existence who choose to have a kid dependent on their circumstances or something like that. Again, I'm going to listen with an open mind to what Ash said in your video, but from all of my experiences in the animal rights movement, Lawrence, all of them have been negative. I haven't had a good experience with intersectionality in the animal rights movement.
Yeah, well, I think if Ashley will see your video, you'll see Ashley's video, and if you guys from seeing each other's videos have more you want to say, maybe we can host like a discussion around it. Or if other people see it, doesn't necessarily have to be you too, but like if people think that this is a conversation worth like going into more now, then I think like why not? It's better to it's better to create a culture around this topic of being able to express your opinions, because that's the exact opposite of what it was in animal rights. You weren't allowed to express your opinions unless they were like the correct opinions, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I think we should definitely be like cultivating that sort of culture around it. But before we finish, where can people follow you, keep up to date with what you're doing, like both you personally, but also like Carnism Debunked?
Sure. Yeah. So if you want to check out my Instagram, it's carnism_debunked, same as on TikTok. Twitter, Carnism Debunked, all one word. YouTube, the YouTube channel Carnism Debunked, carnismdebunked.com website. That's me. And then if you want to see my personal page on Facebook, it's just George Martin, because I post a lot of like animal rights content and stuff on there on my personal page as well. And you can even check me out if you want to hear deeper about my thoughts on antinatalism. You can check out my episode where I was a guest on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast with Amanda. That was a really good episode, and I love Amanda's work. I think she's a great podcast host. So I was really honored that she chose to have me as a guest on a podcast that I actually like to listen to. So if you want to actually hear me talk about antinatalism and stuff, I would recommend listening to my episode there with Amanda. But yeah, thanks for having me anyway, Lawrence, and it's been a really good talk.
Yeah, I'll link all of those below, including your episode on the EA podcast, so that people don't have to scour the internet to find all that stuff. I'll just put it all in the description.
Cool.
But cool, yeah. Thanks for coming on.